Ever left a family gathering early just to protect your peace?
My dad did not pose a question or invite a conversation. He delivered a directive the way a boss dismisses an intern, telling me to sign the house over to my sister because, in his words, that he did not even try to soften. She was the one worth investing in, and I felt the kind of tired anger that does not explode so much as collect itself. So I slid a plain folder across the table and told him that before we talk about who deserves what, he might want to ask why the blood test does not line up the way he thinks it does, and the room fell into that thick quiet where everyone studies their own hands because they are afraid to look up. And if you are wondering how I walked into that moment without shaking, I should tell you what came before it. Because none of this started with a house or a folder, it started with years of being told I was the support beam while my sister was the skyline. I grew up in a family where the scoreboard was never hidden, where my dad bragged about my sister's potential like it was a stock he picked early, and he treated me like the stable bond you hold because you need something boring to balance the risk. And I learned to keep the peace by picking up the things no one wanted, the apartment lease when money got tight, the medical appointments for our mother when work got busy for everyone else, the endless logistics that make a household function but somehow never count as achievement when people go around the table listing their wins, and each time my sister announced some new push, a certificate here or a coaching program there, my dad opened his wallet and his mouth in the same motion, throwing money and speeches at her like confetti while reminding me that I was responsible and sensible and therefore fine without help, which is the nice way families tell you they will lean on you as long as you allow it. The house became the battleground not because I asked for it, but because I was the only one who kept it standing when things went sideways. The only one who called the plumber and kept the furnace alive and negotiated with the bank when our mother had a health scare and payments wobbled. And my name ended up on the paperwork because someone had to sign the hard forms, the ones that carry late fees and legal warnings, and I did it without drama because I thought it would buy me the one thing I really wanted, which was uncomplicated peace, the kind where you are not compared to your sister as if the two of you were auditioning for the role of family favorite. When my dad told me to sign it over because my sister was worth the investment, I wish I could say I laughed, but what I did was worse and probably smarter. I asked him to slow down and walk me through his math as if this were a project at work. What return he expected, what timeline he had in mind, what risk he was assuming, and the more he talked the clearer it became that he did not see a house or equity or risk. He saw a ritual where I handed over security to prove I was a team player. And once I understood that, something in me moved from pleading to planning, because I knew there was no version of the conversation where he would hear me if I spoke the language of fairness, so I would have to speak the language he respected, which was leverage. I started by doing the unglamorous things that make people like my dad uneasy. I put a fraud alert with the county recorder so any filing with my name would ping me immediately. I called the title company to confirm that no packet could move without my notarized signature and an in-person identification check, and I sent an email to the bank to make sure payoff details were locked behind my authorization. And I did all of that without announcing it in the family group chat because this was not about performative defiance. This was about building a floor under my own feet, and once that floor felt sturdy, I began to look backward, not out of spite, but because patterns leave breadcrumbs if you have the patience to stop sweeping them away. In an old box with warranty booklets and school records, I found a tangle of things most families forget about: immunization cards, insurance copies, and a small index card from a school physical with my sister's blood type written in a rushed nurse's scrawl. And I remember staring at the letters not because I am some kind of amateur detective, but because in middle school biology, we all memorized those compatibility charts that seemed like trivia until life makes them very not trivial, and a question I had never let myself form began to take shape, not about who my sister was to me, because she is my sister through history and mess and all the shared looks across uncomfortable tables, but about what my dad had built his righteousness on, which was the story that he had sacrificed for the shining daughter while tolerating the dependable one. I did not run to my sister with what I was thinking because I was not sure yet, and I am not cruel, and I did not confront my mother because there are kinds of pain that you do not throw like a drink in someone's face. So I did something that will make some people nod and others judge me. I scheduled a routine blood panel for myself at the same clinic where my sister had a recent visit and, while I was at it, I asked for a copy of historical records for insurance reconciliation, which is a normal request that offices handle every day, and then I called my dad and, in my calmest voice, told him that if he wanted me to sign anything, he should set up a family meeting with a notary present so there would be no confusion later, which satisfied his love of logistics and control and bought me time to build mine. If you are waiting for the part where I raise my voice or throw a glass, it is not coming, because my version of revenge at that stage was quieter and, to me, far more satisfying. I opened the family group text where my dad usually dictated plans, and I wrote a long, steady message that said I would not sign any transfer without independent counsel, a certified appraisal, and full disclosure of any side agreements, and that I had initiated a legal review of past property changes to ensure compliance with state law, and I watched the little typing bubbles pop up and disappear while my dad recalculated how certain he felt about his own authority, and that was the first time in a long time that I felt the balance shift, not spectacularly, but clearly enough to register in my chest. What I did not add to that message, what I kept to myself as I waited for the clinic to call back and the meeting to be scheduled, was the larger question that had taken root and would not let go. The one about the letters on an old card and the story my dad tells about who deserves what, and by the time he confirmed the notary and declared that the house issue would be settled in one sitting, I had decided exactly how I would walk into that room and what I would put on the table before any pen touched any page, because if my dad wanted to turn this into a business decision, then I would bring him the kind of documentation that makes businessmen stop talking. And the only thing I needed now was one envelope that would either end this quietly or blow everything open. When I left that first meeting with my father, I did not storm out or slam any doors, because anger, while satisfying in the moment, tends to evaporate too quickly and leave you standing there with nothing but a sore throat. So instead, I walked away with the kind of quiet determination that makes people underestimate you, and I began collecting the fragments of history that most families assume will never matter. The small slips of paper and routine medical notes that look harmless on their own, but, when placed side by side, tell a story no one was prepared to hear. I knew that if I was going to stand my ground against a man like my father, who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative with volume and confidence, I would need something more than emotion or reason. I would need undeniable evidence. The sort of thing that could not be waved away as me being dramatic or resentful, and that meant going back into the archives of our lives with the patience of someone searching for a lost receipt that proves the charge was never theirs to pay. The first step was simple, because it involved nothing more than requesting old insurance summaries and copies of routine blood work that had been filed through the same provider for years, documents that, in most families, gather dust in folders no one ever bothers to update, and as I flipped through them I began noticing details that stuck out not because they were dramatic, but because they were inconsistent, such as the fact that my father's listed blood type was one that would make it biologically impossible for him to have a child with my sister's recorded type, a detail that, once you see it, cannot be unseen. Though of course I needed more than a memory of high school biology to bring that up in a confrontation that could change the shape of everything we knew. I spent evenings in front of my laptop, combing through the language of medical reports that were meant for bureaucrats rather than family detectives, highlighting dates and codes and references, and with each line my suspicion hardened into something sharper, something that carried weight, though I told no one about it because the moment I spoke it aloud would be the moment it became irreversible. At work, people assumed I was distracted by some trivial stress, and maybe in a way I was, except what I carried in my bag every day was a manila folder that was steadily thickening with copies, scans, and printouts that all whispered the same possibility. My sister was not my father's biological daughter, and the pedestal he had built for her was balanced on a lie that he had either known and buried or never discovered, because he trusted our mother's version of events without question. The thought of confronting him with this information was dizzying, because it was not just about the house anymore, it was about the foundation of our family and the identity of the person who had always been placed above me as the chosen one. And the risk was enormous, because if I was wrong I would look paranoid, bitter, and cruel, but if I was right I would be detonating a truth that could not be contained once it was spoken. I could not shake the memory of my father's face when he told me to sign the house over, the casual certainty, the dismissive tone, the way he spoke as if I should feel honored to even have the chance to prove my loyalty. And that image fueled me as I reached out to a discreet testing service, arranging for my own DNA results to be archived alongside records that would later be compared. Because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I allowed myself to even hint at what I suspected. The waiting period was excruciating, and I filled the days with busy tasks, telling myself that patience was part of the revenge, because the longer I held the secret, the more leverage I had. And the more time I had to plan how to reveal it in a way that would cut through every excuse my father might try to deploy. When the sealed envelope finally arrived, plain and unremarkable on the outside, I held it in my hands for hours before I opened it, because I understood that inside was either my confirmation or my humiliation. And either way nothing would ever be the same again, and I needed to be steady enough to carry the truth without flinching. That night I sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the paper, and read the lines slowly, once, twice, 3 times, until the words settled in like a stone. The biological markers made it clear. My sister and my father could not be linked the way a parent and child are supposed to be, and whatever story had been told in our house all those years was missing a chapter no one had dared to acknowledge. I did not cry or shout. I simply sat there with the envelope beside me, knowing that I now possessed the kind of fact that could break a man who believed himself untouchable, and the only question left was when and how I would choose to let it surface. I did not sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because of the sheer gravity of holding a secret this large, one that could flip the hierarchy of our family in a single sentence, and by dawn I had decided on one thing with absolute clarity. I would not waste this information on a private argument or a back-and-forth fight that could be rewritten in memory. I would deliver it in the one setting where my father always assumed he had the upper hand, the family table where he made pronouncements and expected obedience. He had already scheduled the notary meeting for the transfer papers, a gathering he imagined would be the closing act of his control, and I realized with an almost cold satisfaction that it was the perfect stage. Because nothing amplifies truth like silence in a room full of people who thought they already knew the story. So I placed the envelope in my folder, slid it under the other documents, and carried on as if nothing had changed, answering texts, smiling at small talk, even agreeing when my sister bragged about how much my father trusted her with the future. And the entire time I felt like a chess player advancing pieces while knowing that the checkmate was already written, because whatever else happened, the day would come when my father would ask me again to sign, and instead of ink, I would hand him the one piece of paper that would make every word he had spoken about loyalty and investment collapse under its own weight. The morning after the envelope settled the question that had been chewing a hollow in my chest, I understood that outrage would not be the tool that moved anything in my favor, and that the only thing that ever made my father blink was paperwork with consequences. So I started building a wall of boring, undeniable things that men like him cannot shout down, beginning with a consultation call to a modest attorney who did not care about family drama and only cared about signatures, statutes, and the kind of words that make county clerks nod, and I asked for exactly what I needed, which was a letter that said no document with my name would be valid if signed under pressure, that any transfer would require a certified appraisal and an inspection on file, and that all communication about the property would route through counsel from that moment forward, because if my father wanted to treat the house like business, I could do business. And when that letter went out by email with my sister, and my mother copied, the group chat that usually buzzed like a hive went quiet in that telling way that means people are not ignoring you, they are regrouping. I followed the letter with actions that look small until you realize how much power they hold, walking into the county office on my lunch break to file a simple homestead declaration that, in plain language, said this was my primary residence and therefore not something that could be passed around like a football at a tailgate, and then I called the title company to put a freeze on any file that mentioned my parcel without my in-person notarized consent, which is the kind of sentence that makes Clerks repeat it back because it signals that a person knows where the levers are, and I did it all with a steady voice that even surprised me because the difference between fear and preparation is not courage, it is paperwork. While those protections settled into place, I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began building a clean timeline of every bill I had paid to keep the roof above our heads. Not just the big obvious ones like mortgage installments and tax checks, but the small relentless ones, like emergency plumbers and winter service on a dying furnace, and with each line item I felt less like the overlooked daughter and more like a patient accountant who knows the audit will eventually arrive. I had told myself I would not weaponize the lab results until I could use them with precision, not as a splash of drama, but as a calibrated strike. So I made an appointment with the clinic to request a notarized chain of custody statement that explained the blood type incompatibility in words even my father would understand. And when the nurse explained that such a letter could be issued if I provided proper identification and a modest fee, I thanked her in a voice that sounded normal only. Because I had rehearsed it, then walked out to my car and just gripped the steering wheel until the shaking turned into breathing. Because it is one thing to suspect that the myth of your family is built on sand, and another to hold the certificate that will erase the pedestal your father stood on while calling you the dependable one. Since I know my father's strengths and habits as well as my own, I anticipated the counter. And the counter came quickly in the form of a forwarded calendar invite from him with the notary's name bolded and the subject line announcing that we would be concluding the transfer and moving our family forward, which is the kind of phrase people use when they plan to step on your neck with a smile, and I pressed accept, not because I intended to give him what he wanted, but because I wanted him. Relaxed and overconfident, the way he always gets when the room is full of witnesses, and he thinks that tone can substitute for truth. In the days leading up to the meeting, I did something I had never done with my sister, which was to ask her to coffee alone, and I gave her a chance to be better than the person our father had trained her to be. Laying out in long, careful sentences that the house represented years of sacrifice she never had to make, and that if she insisted on pressing this, there would be fallout none of us could control, and she smiled the way people smile when they think they are being gracious to someone beneath them, and said that Dad had a plan for both of us and mine was to be free of responsibility. And I knew in that instant that she had no idea that the very story she weaponized was about to snap back on the hand that threw it. The day before the notary appointment, I sent one more email that did not sound angry. It sounded administrative, and it attached 3 things my father would hate in equal measure. A recent inspection that listed a pile of costly repairs he never bothered to learn about, a certified appraisal that came in lower than the fantasy number he tossed out whenever he talked about smart investing, and my ledger of payments that documented, down to the last service call, who had actually kept this place alive, and the subject line said simply that these materials were required for any discussion of transfer so that all parties understood the real value and obligations, and within minutes my phone lit up with his call, which I let roll to voicemail because I wanted the anger recorded, not negotiated. On the morning of the meeting I did one small, ruthless thing that will sound petty until you understand how my father operates. I asked the notary, very politely and entirely within procedure, to confirm that any signatory could stop the process at any moment and request the session be noted as discontinued due to pressure, and when she said, "Of course, that is standard," I felt a calm settle over me. The kind that comes when the exits are marked and the rules are printed on the wall, and I walked into the room where my father had gathered his audience, set my folder on the table beside the neat stack of documents he believed would close the matter, and before anyone could begin the little speeches about family unity and sacrifice, I announced that I had already filed the homestead declaration and that any attempt to file a deed without my verified consent would bounce back from the county like a bad check, which was not a scream or a scene, but it was revenge in my language. The language of limits, because I watched my father's face do that calculation he does when a simple plan meets an unexpected boundary. He recovered with that familiar smoothness and told the notary we would proceed anyway because I was here and willing to sign, and I smiled in a way he did not recognize and said I was indeed ready to sign exactly one thing, then slid a smaller envelope to the center of the table and explained, in a tone light enough to sound almost generous, that the fastest way to move forward would be to ask why the blood types on file cannot produce the daughter he keeps calling his best investment. And as my sister looked at our mother, and my mother reached for a chair to steady herself, I folded my hands, not because I needed the pose, but because I wanted my father to understand that I was finished arguing and that the next voice in the room would not be mine. When the envelope touched the center of the table the way a gavel touches wood at the end of an argument, my father gave me that tired little smirk he uses when he believes I am bluffing for attention, and he told the notary in a smooth, almost bored voice that we would wrap the transfer first and deal with whatever drama I had brought later, at which point I asked the notary, as courteously as a person can when the ground is about to split, to mark the record with a simple statement that a material dispute had been raised that directly impacted consent, and I slid the chain of custody letter across so she could see that the document was not some internet printout, but a verified note from a clinic that has known our family name for years. And as the notary read, the room developed that careful stillness that grown people adopt when they suspect they are standing too close to a fire and cannot yet tell who is about to be burned. My father went for the move he always tries first, which is to declare that the paperwork is wrong and that some nurse probably mixed up a chart and that none of this has anything to do with the house anyway. And he aimed the lecture at me as if volume and posture could make ink retreat back into the page, while my sister folded her arms with that impatient confidence of someone who has never been told no in a room where her father is present. And my mother stared at a spot on the table as though a focus point could hold her together, so I kept my voice even and explained that blood type incompatibility is not a gossip item or a rumor, it is math with proteins, and it does not wobble because someone is offended. Then I asked the notary to pause the session under the rule she had already confirmed at the start, the one that allows any signatory to discontinue when pressure or disputed fact appears. And she nodded because procedure is the one language that cannot be bullied. I told my father that, in addition to the clinic letter, I had brought the inspection report, the certified appraisal, and a ledger of every dollar I had spent over the years to keep this roof from collapsing during the winters he never checked on because he assumed I had it handled, and I invited him to correct any line item he believed was inaccurate, which he ignored in favor of pointing at the deed like it was a magic card that would make me disappear, so I reached into my folder and took out the other thing I had filed that morning, a stamped copy of the notice of dispute with the county recorder that flags any attempted transfer or encumbrance on the property for manual review with my consent required in person. And I set it in front of him with the calm of a person who has finally accepted that you do not win against a bully by pleading for fairness. You win by putting a locked door between his hand and your life. The notary, to her credit, did not try to play referee or therapist. She simply said she could not proceed while a dispute was recorded and while one party was alleging facts that, if true, would render the consent void. And she began gathering her stamp as my father raised his voice another notch, asking me why I was trying to humiliate the family and whether I understood how far I was pushing things, which is what he says when he means he can feel the ground shifting. And I looked at my sister and reminded her, not with malice, but with an honesty I have earned, that she was asking me to underwrite a future with money and security I built, and that I had asked her privately to rethink this path before the fallout became public. And she rolled her eyes and said I was being vindictive and that none of this changes the fact that Dad chose her, and I said that choices built on false premises do not hold up in the light, and if she wanted me to act like a silent foundation then she should have remembered who paid for the steal. My mother finally lifted her head, and I could see that she understood exactly what the letter implied, so I told her gently that I was not hunting for a confession, and I was not interested in digging through the past like a tabloid, that I only cared about being treated with the basic respect I had been denied since we were teenagers, and that the one thing I would not do today or any day is sign away the only leverage that ever made my father listen, and I watched something shift in her face. A calculation mixed with dread, because she knows what silence purchased and what it cost. My father tried to pivot back to logistics by announcing that the House discussion would continue at his attorney's office without my melodrama, And I reminded him that my counsel was already on copy and that any meeting would begin with the inspection he never read, the ledger he never asked to see, and the question he never thought he would have to answer, which is how he planned to explain the laboratory math that does not care about pride or speeches. Since he would not meet the moment, I met it for him by stating that I was prepared to offer a narrow path that would keep this contained, and I said it slowly so no one could pretend later that they misheard me. That I would refrain from filing a formal petition to clarify parentage for future inheritance, and I would keep the clinic letter off any court docket if he committed in writing to 3 simple terms today. That the house matter was closed with no transfer contemplated, that my prior contributions were acknowledged in a signed memorandum attached to the property file, and that all future family finance decisions affecting me would be put in writing with my approval required. And I let that sit while he pounded the table with all the old phrases about loyalty and gratitude, because sometimes the most surgical revenge is not a dramatic reveal. It is the moment you watch a man realize that the tricks he used for decades no longer work on the person he trained to be quiet. He said I was blackmailing him, and I told him I was drawing a boundary with documentation, and that if he preferred the alternative, I would simply step outside, call my attorney, and allow a court to drag this into daylight where no one controls the narrative. And the notary cleared her throat and asked, in the voice of a person ready to clock out, whether we would be discontinuing, and I said yes, we would. Because no one was signing anything today or any day that begins with a lie, and I collected my papers with hands that did not shake because the shaking had finally run out of reasons to stay. As I stood, I added one last thing, not loudly and not cruelly, just plainly, that there was one more page in the folder, the one my father would hate more than the clinic letter. The one that explained why the blood types do not match, and who knew about it, and for how long, and that I would open it only after he acknowledged, out loud, that he tried to bully me into surrendering what I built, and when he refused on reflex and turned red with outrage, I looked at my mother and said a single sentence that did not need to be longer, that if anyone wanted this to end quietly, it would have to start with her telling him the truth. And the room went so still that you could hear the notary's pen click shut, and my mother said my name in a voice that came from somewhere old, and I knew we had reached the moment where silence would either break or bury what was left of us. My mother did not give a speech or a confession with flourishes. She looked at the notary's closed stamp, at my sister's tight jaw, at my father's growing panic, and then at me with that tired resolve that belongs to people who have run out of corridors to escape through. And she said that a long time ago when my father and she were barely speaking and the house felt like a waiting room with bad lighting, she made a mistake with a man who did not stay, and that when the doctor later explained the blood types, my father chose the version of the story that worked for his image and his business and his friends, which was to keep the family intact, demand silence, and build a new narrative that put my sister on a pedestal so high no one would ever ask how the foundation was poured. And while she spoke, my father kept shaking his head, as if denial could rewind paperwork. But he never said she was lying because he knew he could not, and in that instant the oxygen in the room changed because the thing I had dragged into the light was not a rumor or an accusation. It was a truth they had both managed for years while I carried the weight of being the reliable one they could always lean on without ever being invited to stand beside them. My sister went straight for the wound that still makes me flinch, asking my mother whether she knew, and still let our father turn me into the family workhorse while calling her the prize. And my mother said that guilt had whispered every day, and that she told herself she was protecting all of us from a worse crisis, and that over time, she believed her own story, because that is how people survive bad choices. Which did not make it better and did not make me kinder, but it made the math of my childhood make sense in a way that landed with a dull finality, and I realized that the clean revenge I wanted had already happened the moment silence cracked in a room where my father had always been the loudest person present. I did not raise my voice or throw accusations I could not retract. I simply opened my folder, slid a one-page memorandum I had drafted with my attorney across the table, and told my father that there was a way to end this in a single sitting without police, without petitions, and without business associates hearing any of it. and that all it required was his signature and my mother's acknowledgement, and the notary's seal right here on the bottom line, so that when everyone walked away there would be no more texts, no more threats, and no more attempts to repurpose my work into someone else's future. The document was uncomplicated on purpose, because complicated gives bullies places to hide, and it stated that the house remained mine-free of any claim or encumbrance from any family member now or later, that my past expenditures were recognized as sole contributions that required no reimbursement, that any inheritance planning moving forward would treat me and my sister as separate adults with separate accounts rather than instruments in a performance about legacy, and that no party would attempt to transfer, refinance, or list the property without my written consent, and I let a long quiet sit there while he read, because I wanted him to feel what it is like to answer to something other than his own voice. He tried to bargain in the old way by promising that if I handed the deed today, he would make sure I was comfortable later, and I told him that later had already happened for years, and that the bill had been paid by me in cash and time and sleep, and that my offer had an expiration, measured not in days but in patience, because if he refused now I would walk out and file the petition that would put the clinic letter into a public file where explanations become exhibits. And he looked at my mother for rescue and found a person who was finally done building ladders for him to climb over other people. My sister asked whether I was doing this to punish her, and I told her I was doing it to stop a game I never agreed to play, and that what she does with her life, without my house under her feet, is entirely her choice, and that if she wants a relationship with me that does not involve leverage, we can attempt that on new terms, but that I would no longer subsidize a myth that has cost me my place in my own family. And for the first time since we were children, she seemed to see me not as the obstacle in her highlight reel, but as the person who made the highlight reel possible, and she did not apologize, but she did not keep sneering either, which I counted as the beginning of something that might one day resemble honesty. The notary, who had been the quiet witness to a demolition, looked at my father and asked whether he would be signing or whether she should mark the session discontinued, and my father, who had built a life on bluff and certainty, stared at a line on a page that he could not shout away, and he signed with a hand that tried to hide the tremor, then passed the pen to my mother, who signed without looking up, and when the seal pressed down with that dull click, I felt a kind of relief that does not feel like a victory parade. It feels like a door being closed and locked from the inside after years of drafts sneaking under it. I handed each of them a copy and kept the originals, thanked the notary, and I told my father one last thing that I needed for myself, that from now on if he wanted to talk to me he would do it as if I were a person whose time and boundaries mattered, and that if he could not manage that then he could practice silence, because I had learned I could live in quiet just fine. On my way out my mother touched my sleeve and asked whether I would keep the page that named names and dates in the folder instead of the courthouse, and I told her that I would, because I did not need scorched earth to feel like I had finally won. I needed the record of a line I drew and kept, and the knowledge that the house I saved would no longer be used as a leash, and she nodded with a grief that is going to live in our family for a long time, which I cannot fix and do not have to fix. I changed the locks that week, filed the memorandum with the county, forwarded the stamped copy to my attorney, and then I did the most radical thing I could think of, which was nothing. Because the final move in a plan like this is not another reveal or another threat, it is a life lived without asking permission from the person who once believed he owned your future, and as far as I am concerned that is not only justice, it is the cleanest revenge I have ever seen.